What would you do if the man whose life you just saved turned out to be the very person holding the secret behind your father's death? On the coldest night of that winter, at 2 o'clock in the morning, a poor waitress happened to wrest the most ruthless and powerful man in town back from the hands of death. She had no idea that he was the last person to speak with her father, just 3 days before his tragic death. Before we discover where this reckless decision will lead, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to support us. Now, let's step down onto the frozen surface of Corliss Landing. Roman Kessler owned every freight car that rolled through Corliss Landing, held every hand that pulled a throttle lever firmly within his grasp, and controlled every signature put to paper after midnight along this dying river in the Rust Belt. Once the sun went down, no one in town dared speak his name aloud. Until that morning, Kessler was found lying face down on the frozen river, bound tightly with his own ship's mooring cable. His 2 enormous mastiffs lay collapsed on either side of him, rigid as 2 bronze statues ripped from their pedestals. His enemies hadn't left him there to kill him. They'd left him there so the entire town would be forced to witness one truth. Even a man like Roman Kessler could be brought to his knees. He should have died in that 20 degrees below zero cold, and there wasn't a soul in Corliss Landing brave enough to step onto that fragile sheet of ice and bring him back. He didn't die for one reason alone. Nora Kostelic, a waitress whose shift had ended at 2 o'clock in the morning, trudging home along the shipyard, only because her battered old car had run out of gas 3 days earlier. Nora stopped. She stood there and watched him for exactly 40 seconds. Nora was a woman who had lost everything. She'd lost her father beneath the cold waters of the loch, lost the sister who'd left without a word of farewell, and lost the last shred of the reputation she'd once built, all because she dared to ask the one question the entire town wanted buried, and the man lying at her feet, barely clinging to life? For 34 years, he'd never yielded a single thing to anyone. He was a man who could read the whole of a person's fate simply by looking at their hands. A man who always carried a cracked watch in his coat pocket, its hands forever frozen at 3:47, though no one knew why. Then, on the 41st second, Nora knelt on the ice. She had no idea that the moment her knees touched the snow, she'd set a machine of death into motion, one that neither she nor he would ever be able to stop. Because at that very moment, someone stood hidden in the darkness, silently recording everything that was happening, and the first question, as sharp as the fruit knife concealed in Nora's apron pocket, was this: who were they recording this footage for? The only knife Nora Kostelic had on her was the fruit knife tucked inside her apron pocket, the same knife she'd used to slice lemons for 8 straight hours, its blade less than 6 centimeters long and dulled since autumn, and she pulled it out with fingers that had lost all feeling from the moment she stepped through the diner door, then began to saw. Because the anchor cable wrapped around the man's wrist wasn't ordinary rope, but a ship's mooring cable soaked through with river water and frozen into something closer to iron than braided cord, and the blade slipped, so she changed the angle, pressed down, and sawed through one strand at a time, each strand snapping apart with a dry crack, and it took exactly 40 seconds to cut through the first length of cable. The same 40 seconds she'd spent standing there watching him before, and only now did she understand what those 40 seconds had done, because when the final layer of cable came free, and his hand dropped heavily onto the snow, she saw that his fingers had turned a blackish purple from the second knuckle upward, the exact color she'd seen only once before in her life. On the hand of a mechanic pulled from a frozen stretch of river one February when she was 19, and she tore off her glove, pressed 2 fingers to the side of his neck, and waited, but there was nothing, so she shifted her hand half a centimeter, and still there was nothing, and she was about to pull away when it came, a beat so slow she thought she'd imagined it. Then another, after an interval far too long, like a machine that had run out of fuel but was still struggling to complete one final revolution. He was alive, and at 7 minutes past 2 in the morning, in 20 degrees below zero cold that was gnawing into every fiber of flesh, Nora Kostelic knelt on the ice and understood that she'd just crossed a line from which there could be no return. Then she turned toward the two dogs, the larger one lying on its side, its massive blue-gray chest covered by a thin layer of snow, enough to tell her it had been lying there for at least half an hour, the thick folds of skin around its neck frozen rigid in layers, and she placed one hand on its rib cage and felt movement, very faint, very slow, while the smaller dog, a female with pale golden fur, was breathing faster, one cloudy eye partly open and turned toward Nora without seeing her. Both dogs were still alive. All three of them were still alive, and all three were slowly fading, their breaths growing slower and shallower, like three candles burning down to the last of their wicks in a room where no oxygen remained, and Nora sank down among them. Between the man the entire town wanted to see brought to his knees and the two loyal animals that had fallen beside him, and she realized that none of these three lives had enough time left for her to hesitate. She'd lived in this town for 27 years. She knew what this cold did to a body lying motionless on the ice, knew that every passing minute was a door slowly closing, and she looked along the darkened shipyard for anything that might offer shelter, any place with four walls and a roof, while her hand remained on the larger dog's chest, counting each of its sparse breaths, and she began to count, not because anyone had taught her first aid, but because counting was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. Her father had taught her that when she was 7, that the only way not to panic aboard a listing ship was to count something, anything at all, and now she counted the breaths of a dying dog, counted the seconds remaining to a man she'd never known, counted so she wouldn't have to think about how utterly alone she was, surrounded by ice, surrounded by darkness, with 3 lives in her hands, and no one in the world she could rely on. That was when the wall of the loading shed behind her suddenly filled with light, and Nora did not turn around, because she had lived in this town for 27 years, and she knew exactly what that light was, before her mind had time to give it a name. Pale yellow beams sweeping across the corrugated metal high and wide, the headlights of a large vehicle crawling very slowly along the rail yard. And her whole body dropped into the snow before she could think, her chest pressed flat against the unconscious man's chest, her face so close to his that she could smell dried blood and river salt on his skin, and she held her breath, because they had not left. The headlights passed over the two of them once, and then they slowed, and then they swept back in the opposite direction, more slowly this time. And Nora understood that they were not merely passing by, they were searching, they were confirming. Her heart pounded so hard she feared the force of it would travel through her coat and wake the man beneath her, and so she counted, the way her father had taught her, and she had reached 22 when the light stopped completely. And in the silence between the wind and the idling engine, she opened her eyes a fraction and saw it. A small red point of light suspended in the darkness beside the passenger window, perhaps 60 feet away, a point of light she had seen 1,000 times in her life, the recording indicator of a phone, and someone inside that vehicle was holding a phone at eye level, aimed directly at the patch of ice where Roman Kessler lay. And that person was in no hurry at all. They recorded long enough to make certain the image was clear. They held the frame steady the way a person holds something they intend to keep, and then the red light went out. The vehicle released its clutch, its tires grinding over the broken ice, and the engine faded off toward the far end of the yard until nothing remained but the wind. And Nora stayed motionless for another 30 seconds, not because she was afraid, but because something had just opened inside her mind, and she needed those 30 seconds to see it clearly, because people did not film a body, they did not sit in the cold and steady the frame, and wait for the shot to be clean, if all they had wanted was a man dead on the ice. A dead man required no witness and no record. A dead man was simply left and forgotten. But this was different. They had stripped the most powerful man in Corliss Landing, and bound him with his own cable, and arranged him on the frozen river, with his 2 fallen dogs on either side of him, like a scene set on a stage. And then they had filmed it. And a thing that is filmed is not an ending. It is a message, and a message is never made for the person lying in the snow. A message is always made for someone else, someone meant to watch it later, someone meant to understand something from it. And Nora Kostelic lay flat on the frozen ground of the town that had raised her, across the chest of a man the whole town wanted to see brought to his knees, and felt the first real question of that night arrive whole and sharp and cold as the paring knife still in her apron pocket. Because she was a woman who had spent 2 years learning that the shape of a thing tells you who made it and why. And the shape of this told her that tonight was not an execution but a performance. That whoever had done this had wanted an audience. And that meant somewhere out there in the dark a screen would light up, and a face would lean in to watch Roman Kessler broken on the ice. And she did not know whose face it was. She did not know who they had done all of this for. But she understood with a certainty that raised the hair along both of her arms that she was now the only living person who knew the message had been recorded at all. And people who went to such lengths to film a thing like this had never in the history of the world been fond of leaving a witness behind, and so she pressed herself lower against the man beneath her and stared out at the place where the red light had been, and the question turned over once more in the dark, patient and merciless: who were they filming it for? Nora pushed herself upright, and did the first thing anyone in the world would have done. She dug her phone out of her coat pocket, and the screen lit up in the darkness, and threw a pale blue glow across the unconscious face at her feet, and her thumb pressed 9, then 1, and it stopped there, hovering over the third number. Trembling from the cold and from something else, because she had stood in the lobby of the Corliss Landing police station once before, 2 years ago, and she knew exactly what came next. She remembered the room that smelled of burned coffee, the orange plastic chair where she had waited, the 62-page file she had spent 11 months assembling, the water reports and the photographs and the statements from 3 men she had bought coffee for, again and again, before they finally told her anything. And she remembered the way the man across the table had turned through that file. He had not read it. He had flipped through it with one finger, the way a person flips through junk mail. And when he reached the last page, he had closed it and slid it back and told her, in a voice so kind, it took her a moment to understand it was a threat, that her father had been a good man, that the river did not care who was good, that she should get some rest. And 3 weeks later, the case of Tomas Kostelic's death was closed, with 2 words: accidental death. And the signature in the corner belonged to that same man, and Nora looked down at the screen, 9-1, and she understood that within 7 minutes a patrol car would arrive, and within 10 minutes someone would make a call, and within 20 minutes the vehicle that had just left would come back, this time not to record anything. That calling that number tonight would not mean calling for help. It would mean handing Roman Kessler straight back to the people who had left him here, and it would mean handing herself over too, because she was the only living person who knew the message had been filmed, and so she turned off the screen and slipped the phone back into her coat, and that small motion was the strangest thing she had ever done in her life, because it meant that from this moment forward, along this entire dead stretch of river, there was no one left in the world for her to call, and there was only her, and she raised her head and found what she needed: an old freight shed 115 feet down the yard, its sliding door hanging off one roller, abandoned since the river trade began to die. And she measured that distance with her eyes, and knew it would be the longest 115 feet of her life, because Nora Kostelic weighed 115 pounds, and the smaller dog alone weighed near 130, and she found a torn boat tarp frozen into the ice at the water's edge, and stomped it loose and dragged it to the pale golden dog, working her hands beneath that limp weight, lifting, and slipping, lifting again until the animal lay on the tarp, and then she wrapped the ends around her fists and pulled, and she made it 16 feet before she had to stop. Another 3 feet, and she had to stop again, her lungs burning, her legs shaking, and she was bending for the third pull when she heard a sound behind her, heavy and dragging, and she turned and saw that the larger dog had opened his eyes. And no one on earth could have hauled that much weight across that much ice, and Nora had already accepted from the first moment that she would have to leave him. But the dog was not looking at her. He was looking at the smaller one being dragged farther and farther away, and something older than the cold, and older than whatever had been put in his food, pulled him upright. And he could not stand, so he crawled, inch by inch, his front paws clawing at the broken ice, his great gray body dragging a long trail behind him, and he followed, the instinct of the pack doing what human strength could not, and Nora watched him for 2 seconds with her throat tightening for a reason she had no time to understand, and then she bent down and kept pulling. And she moved the smaller dog and rested and came back for the larger one, who had crawled as far as he could, and then dragged him the last stretch. And last of all, she came for the man, and when she slipped her hands beneath his arms and hauled, he gave a very soft groan, and both his heels dug into the ice, and pushed, not awake, only suspended in that place where the body still remembers how to survive. And 1 foot at a time, 1 stop at a time, she got all 3 of them through the door of the freight shed at 2:51 in the morning, and wedged a broken length of wood across it, and slid down the metal wall, and sat there breathing, 3 living creatures on the concrete before her, and no idea at all which door she had just opened. The first thing that reached Roman Kessler was not sound but pain, and he had woken through pain enough times in his life to know how to read it, and he did not move and he did not open his eyes, because 34 years of living in a town where men signed papers after midnight had taught him that the most expensive thing a man could hand his enemy for free was the knowledge that he was awake. And so he lay still and took inventory. Beneath his back was concrete and not ice. Old concrete under fine dust and crystallized salt, the floor of a shed along the yard. The air smelled of rust and oxidized grease and rotting rope, and not of the men who had done this to him. No idling engine, no footsteps circling, only the wind knocking a loose sheet of metal somewhere overhead, in a slow repeating rhythm. And from all of that he concluded before he ever opened his eyes that he was no longer in their hands. And he also concluded that this was not necessarily good news, and he opened his eyes 1 fraction at a time, allowing only a narrow slit until his vision settled, and in the weak light he saw Cassius lying on his side. The great gray chest rising and falling so slowly a person had to watch closely to catch it, his head resting on the cement in a position no dog would ever willingly choose, and a few feet away lay Neva, the smaller one, curled on her side with 1 clouded eye half open and staring into nothing, and that was when it came. Not when he felt the raw rings the cable had left on his wrists. Not when he understood that someone had stripped him and staged him on the frozen river for the whole town to see. The anger of Roman Kessler did not rise because of anything they had done to him. It rose when he saw his 2 dogs lying wrong on a filthy floor, and it came cleanly and silently like water spilling over the rim of a glass. Not hot and not red, only a new temperature he would live in from that moment on, because men could put him on the ground, and men had put him on the ground, and he would take note of it, and repay the debt in full when its time came. But touching something that had followed him without ever asking why, that was a different kind of debt, and he sat up in a single controlled motion, and his body made him pay for it at once. Though he did not let the cost show on his face, and he looked at his freed wrists and saw that the cable had been broken rather than untied, its fibers sawed raggedly through by some blunt blade, and he recorded that fact the way he entered a number into a column, and then he looked up, and 4 feet away a woman stood leaning against the corrugated wall, thin in the way that made her coat look a size too large. Ash-brown hair cut level with her chin by scissors never meant for hair, her face drained white with exhaustion, and she held a flashlight raised across her chest, the way a person holds a weapon she does not know how to use, and she did not run when he sat up, and that was the second thing he recorded. And he said, "You untied me," and it was not a question, and she said as much of it as I could, her voice taut but unbroken, and he asked why, and she was silent a beat longer than necessary, and in that silence he learned more about her than he would learn in the next hour. Because people only hesitate over a question when they already have an answer that frightens them. And she said, "Because you were about to freeze to death, And he said that is not the real answer. And she looked directly at him and said no. But it is the answer you are going to get. And Kessler did not reply to that. He only looked down at the two hands holding the flashlight. Because he read people through their hands. He had done it since he was young. Faces could be trained, but hands could not. And these hands told a story he finished reading in 4 seconds. The knuckles swollen symmetrically on both. The early cold water arthritis of a woman still in her 20s. The skin split into horizontal cracks from cheap industrial soap used every day without gloves. The nails cut down to the flesh for work, and not for looks. A thin callus on the right index finger, where it pressed a tray edge. And beside it on the middle finger, an older rounded callus of the kind that forms only on someone who has spent years writing by hand. 2 calluses that did not belong to the same trade, and he thought no insurance, no one to help her, no one anywhere she could call at 3 in the morning, or she would have called them instead of dragging his dogs across the ice on her own back. And he asked, "What is your name?" A question he almost never asked. And she weighed the price of giving something like that to a man like him, and then she said Nora. And he waited, and she said Nora Kostelic, and something happened. So small that anyone who blinked would have missed it. Not a reaction, but the absence of one. A silence that lasted exactly 1 beat longer than an ordinary silence. Like a machine still running that had just skipped a single cycle, his hand on his knee did not move and his eyes did not shift. But Roman Kessler had stopped. And Nora Kostelic, who had spent 2 years sitting across from men who lied to her about her father, and learning to recognize the precise moment they decided to lie, saw it, and she said, "You know that name," and he did not answer. And she said, "You just stopped. I saw you stop," and he still did not answer. He only looked at her, as his face returned to the flat and unreadable thing it had always been. The face of a man whose name no one along that dying river dared speak aloud after dark. And she understood that the door which had opened for a fraction of a second had closed again, and would not open tonight. Instead of answering her, Kessler did something Nora had not anticipated at all. He planted his hands on the floor and crossed the space to the larger dog, through sheer force of will, rather than whatever strength remained in his muscles, and he lowered himself beside Cassius, and slipped one hand beneath the animal's lower jaw, and opened his mouth and leaned down, and smelled his breath. And he held that position for 4 seconds, and then he released the jaw and rested his palm against that massive gray chest for a moment, and sat upright again, and his face did not change, but the air inside the freight shed did, and Nora felt it travel down her spine before she understood why. And he said, "They could not bring me down," his voice perfectly calm, and it was that calm that made what followed so frightening. "They brought down my dogs." And he said it not so she would understand, but because he needed to hear the words aloud once before he could believe them himself. Because together, the 2 mastiffs weighed close to 300 pounds, and no one could get near him while they were still standing. Not 4 men, not 6, could have bound him with his own cable while Cassius was on his feet. And so the dogs had to go down first, and the dogs had not gone down from a beating. He had smelled it in the animal's breath. That faint sweetness clinging to the back of the tongue, the kind of thing a man who had spent his life around the yards learned to recognize very early. Something put in the food. And that was where everything broke open. Because Cassius and Neva did not eat food bought from a store. Their food was mixed in one place only, in the small kitchen behind the yard office every morning. And for years, exactly 3 people on this earth had ever laid a hand on that bucket. And Kessler named them slowly, as though reading from a list he had memorized long ago, and never imagined he would one day have to recite. The first had worked for him 11 years, the second 13, and the third had once pulled him out of a car going down through the ice on the East Channel. "No one from the outside could touch that bucket," he said, "which means this did not begin out there. It began inside my own house." And Nora stood perfectly still, understanding at once the size of what had just been said, understanding that this man had laid bare before her the one wound he could not bind shut. That one of his own had sold him, and she asked quietly, "Who did this to you?" And Kessler looked down at his hand, the one missing a joint from the smallest finger, And he said, "You already know. You have simply not dared to say it aloud." And then he spoke the name. Gideon Ashcroft. And Nora felt the blood drain from her face, because that was a name she had carried for 2 years. The chairman who spoke in a warm voice at Harbor Commission meetings, the man whose signature sat somewhere near the 2 words that had closed her father's file, and to hear it spoken now in an abandoned shed at 3 in the morning, by the last man on earth she had ever wanted to hear say, it turned something over in her chest, and she was about to speak when Neva moved. The smaller dog dragged herself up from the concrete slowly and awkwardly, and she did not go toward her master. She turned her whole body toward the far end of the shed, toward the north wall and past it toward the row of cold storage sheds pressed against the water, and she raised her muzzle and drew in a slow, deep breath, her nostrils widening and closing again, and she did not growl, and she did not bark. She simply stood there aimed at some unseen point out in the darkness, and that stillness raised gooseflesh along both of Nora's arms, and behind her, Cassius lifted his head as well, and stared in the same direction, and began to breathe. No barking, only breathing, slow and steady and heavy, the sound of a very old and very large machine being started again. And Nora whispered, "That isn't normal, is it?" And Kessler watched his 2 dogs, and something close to complete clarity had returned to his eyes for the first time since he had opened them on that floor. And he said, "No, that is recognition." And Nora understood that whatever the dogs were pointed at, they had met it before, and that out there in the storm gathering over the dying river, something was waiting that both animals knew by its scent, and that the night was not finished with any of them yet. They followed the dogs out into the storm, and it took them far longer to cross the yard than it should have, because the wind had turned into something with a will of its own, blowing sideways instead of down and lashing Nora's face with ice sharp enough that she had to walk tilted, one shoulder thrust forward like a person forcing her way through water, and Neva led, moving slowly with her head low to the snow, never once hesitating, never circling back to catch the scent again, simply moving straight ahead along a path she had known before they ever broke through the door. And Cassius dragged himself at the rear, his heavy breathing the only sound Nora could still hear besides the wind, and the row of cold storage sheds emerged through the white, like a line of low gray teeth. And most of them stood open, their doors long gone, their insides filled with snow and debris washed in from the river, but one did not. Its door was sealed, and hanging from it was a padlock, and Nora stopped in front of it and understood at once, without anyone saying a word, why the dog had brought them here. Because the lock was new. So new that the steel still held its shine without a trace of rust or salt, while everything else within a mile of this place had been eaten down to the bone by the river years ago. A new lock on a shed the whole town believed had been abandoned, and Kessler studied it for 3 seconds, and then picked up an iron bar from the scrap along the wall, and wedged it into place and broke the lock with one dry crack. And inside it was darker and colder than the storm outside, and the smell was wrong. And Nora switched on the flashlight, and her first thought was the thing everyone in Corliss Landing thought of when they heard the name Roman Kessler. And she was wrong. There were blue plastic drums stacked in rows, and she pried the lid off one, and inside was mud. Nothing but mud, gray and thick, and smelling of clean river silt. And she stood staring at it, understanding nothing for 4 full seconds. And then she saw the label on the lid, and the whole world inside her mind turned over. An identification code, a set of coordinates, a sampling date, and those coordinates belonged to the discharge point south of Corliss Landing, the stretch of water she had photographed and measured and given 11 months of her life to. And she understood in a single cold rush that the mud inside this drum was not the mud from that water, because the mud there smelled of metal and left a film on the skin that took 3 washings to remove, and this was clean silt taken from somewhere harmless and packed into drums and labeled and stored here to wait for the day the state inspectors came to collect their samples. 27 drums, 27 spotless records manufactured inside an abandoned shed to prove that this river was still healthy while it was dying. And Nora looked up and Kessler did not explain anything. He only stared at the rows of drums and said 3 sentences. That 7 years ago, they had begun to kill this river. That the fish had gone, and the work had gone, and the town had gone with them, and that now they had come to collect. And he drove the lid back onto the drum with the heel of his hand, and the number 7 years struck Nora like a fist where she stood, with the clean silt still on her fingers, because 7 years ago was the year her father had taken the tug out onto that water for the last time. And she understood that whatever had gone into this river had taken Tomas Kastelik with it, that the 2 words on his file and the 27 drums in this shed were the same crime, wearing 2 different faces. And she was about to speak when Kessler crossed to the northeast corner, where one wall met the other, and crouched and slid a piece of baseboard aside with 2 fingers, with the practiced motion of a man who had done it 50 times before, and in the hollow of the wall was a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, and he opened it, and inside was a gun, clean and dry and oiled, and Nora looked at it, and then at him and said, "You prepared for this day," and Kessler folded the oilcloth again carefully, and tucked the gun into his coat, and said, "I prepare for every day. That is why I am still alive." And outside the wind rose another notch against the metal walls, and Nora stood among the drums that held the proof of everything she had lost, and understood that she had walked into the center of the thing she had been circling for 2 years, and that there was no walking back out of it now. Nora turned back to the drums and did the things 7 years of the work she loved had taught her to do before anything else. She took out her phone to photograph them, and she managed 4 pictures before the screen showed her the words she had lived with for 2 years, storage full, and she began deleting 20 photographs, then 30, and the circle kept spinning while the battery slid toward 11% in a shed 10 degrees below zero. And she understood she had perhaps 6 minutes before the phone died completely, and she needed something else, and she knew she had something else, and she slipped her hand into the inside pocket of her coat, the pocket she had sewn back together with black thread the autumn before, and pulled it out. A small handheld voice recorder, its black plastic casing yellowed at the edges, a crack along the right side covered with a strip of blue tape applied with great care, its edge cut perfectly straight, and she held it in her palm and stood motionless, because it was not hers. It had belonged to her father. Tomas Kastelik had bought it second-hand off a shelf on the river road some winter she could no longer place. And he had used it to record foolish small things, coordinates and fuel prices, and the names of men who owed him money. And once, without warning her, he had recorded her singing when she was a girl, and played it back for the whole family at supper, and laughed until his eyes watered while she sat there burning with embarrassment. And he had pressed that blue tape onto the crack with his own hands, and it had come back to her with his wallet and his keys inside a drawstring bag at the yard office reception 7 years ago, and she had kept it for 7 years, and carried it through 3 moves and set it on her bedside table every night, and in all those 7 years she had never once dared to turn it on. Because she was a reporter, and she had played thousands of other people's recordings, but not this one, because as long as she did not turn it on, it could still contain anything, and one of the things it might contain was his voice. And her thumb rested on the power button, and she pressed it, and a small green light came on. It still held a charge after 7 years. And that impossible, meaningless detail nearly took her legs out from under her where she stood. Because a cheap machine left in a drawer should have been dead for years, and this one was not. As though it had been waiting, as though it had kept just enough of itself alive for the one night she would finally need it, and she would never be able to explain it, and she stopped trying to. She only accepted it the way a person accepts a thing too strange and too gentle to question. And a single line appeared on the tiny screen, memory full, of course. And she opened the file list to delete something, and the entries appeared numbered and dated from oldest to newest. And she scrolled down past the spring, and her finger stopped on the last file. Dated 3 days before the tug went out onto the river, and never came back. And she pressed play by reflex, and she would think about that moment for the rest of her life. About how she had not made any decision at all, How 7 years of fear had ended with a movement of her finger she had not even given herself time to permit. And there was wind on the recording. And the sound of a small engine running somewhere far off. And then there was her father's voice. And Nora Kostelic stood inside a freezing shed in the middle of a storm and heard her father speak for the first time in 7 years. And his voice was deeper than she remembered. And she understood from the very first word that he had started recording before he ever placed the call. That he had known the call mattered. That he had known he might need it later. That a fisherman who had never finished school had known how to protect himself, and it still had not been enough. And then the person on the other end answered, and Nora stopped breathing, because she had spent 2 years preparing herself for the warm public voice of Gideon Ashcroft, and this was not that voice. This was deeper and slower. The voice of a man who never needed to raise it, because every room had already gone silent for him. And it was the voice of Roman Kessler 7 years younger. And her father said, "Do you understand what you are asking me to do?" And the voice said, "I am asking you to do the right thing. Just once." And there was a silence. And then Kessler's younger voice said, "The right thing will get you killed." And her father said, "Then let it kill me." And the recording ended, and Nora slowly raised her head, and the man stood a few feet away watching her, and there was nothing on his face. No denial, and no explanation, and not even surprise. And that emptiness chilled her more deeply than the cold. Neither of them spoke of the recording, because there was no time. Cassius had risen at the door of the shed, and the sound of his breathing filled the whole space. And Kessler said, "Move. Now." And they left the cold storage and started back toward the lock, because he said it was the only way out of the yard without passing the road the vehicle had taken. And Nora followed him with her father's voice still filling her mind, and she would remember later that she had walked into the most dangerous place of her life, while barely present at all, and the storm was no longer weather. It had become a living thing with a rhythm of breath, swallowing every sound into its belly and releasing it somewhere else. And visibility had shrunk to a circle of milky white a few feet across, that moved with them and refused to show anything beyond its edge. And the first shot came from above and went high. Nora heard it tear through the air somewhere over her head, and she froze for half a second. And within that half second, Kessler had seized the collar of her coat and dragged her down behind a fallen cedar lying across the slope. And she landed face down in the snow, and he lay on his side with one hand holding her shoulder to the ground. And he did not look up. He tilted his head and counted. And Nora watched him, and understood he was not counting the shots. He was counting their echoes as they bounced between the two walls of the lock. Reading from the delay between them, something she had no ability to read, and he said 4, and she said 4 what? And he said 4 guns. And he released her shoulder and said, "Stay here. Do not move unless I pull you." And then he left. And he did not run. And that was the thing Nora could not understand across the next several minutes, that the man never ran a single step. He slid down toward the water's edge using the sound of the half-frozen river to cover his own footsteps, and moved at the pace of a man who had the whole evening to spare. And later he would tell her that haste got people killed, that hurried men made noise, and noise handed the enemy coordinates they should have been made to pay for. And Nora took out her phone, 11%. And she propped it in the fork of a root and aimed the lens up the slope and left it recording, because it was the only thing in the world she knew how to do, and because from that moment on she understood that the only thing capable of bringing down Gideon Ashcroft was not a gun but a file. And above her, Kessler picked up a stone and threw it hard and far to the left. And it struck a maple and sounded like a footstep, and then he moved to the right, and a moment later 2 of the guns fired toward that maple, and he waited until they had finished, and then he fired once, only once, and Nora understood he was not trying to hit anyone when she heard the bark of a tree burst apart, well above the height of a man's head. He was telling the 4 of them spread across the slope that something below them knew exactly where each of them stood, and they answered wildly. Shot after shot fired into the darkness and the storm, and the places where nothing existed, and Nora lay flat behind the fallen tree, and heard them begin calling to one another, their voices thin and ragged, and she understood the rule Kessler had lived by his whole life. That fear makes noise. And then came Cassius. The dog appeared out of the white, climbing up from the water's edge, and he did not run. He could not run. 300 pounds of him on legs that had not recovered from what was put in his food could not run through deep snow, and that was precisely what made him the most frightening thing on that slope. He walked, slowly and heavily, his head lower than his shoulders, his folded muzzle nearly brushing the snow, and he did not bark once. He only breathed, and the sound of his breathing arrived a good 10 feet before he did, and one of the 4 men turned and saw him, and Nora saw the man see him, saw the moment he froze and raised his gun and lowered it, and raised it again, and she understood that he could do nothing at all. Because something was moving toward him with the steady patience of a clock, and nothing in this world could stop it, and the dog did not chase him, he simply came, and there was a shout, and then the wind took it, and the man broke and scrambled back up the slope away from that slow and endless approach, and Nora lay in the snow and watched the pack instinct do what no weapon on that hill could have done. And at that exact moment, at the far end of the slope, perhaps 70 meters down, a vehicle switched on its headlights, 2 beams cutting straight through the falling snow, sweeping across the slope, and pinning the 4 figures scattered there against the white ground, like moths mounted on a board, and there was no siren, and no loudspeaker, and no one stepped out. Only the lights, and Nora narrowed her eyes and saw enough to know one thing, that the vehicle carried no license plates, and the men on the slope pulled back immediately, cleanly, without panic, moving in 2 pairs, retreating in a zigzag toward the tree line, and vanishing into the white within 40 seconds, and Nora lay there, and watched the way they withdrew, and understood a cold truth. That they were not running because they were afraid, they were retreating because they were professionals, and professionals did not work under bright lights. They knew they were being watched, they knew they were being filmed, and there it was again, the same shape as the red point of light on the ice 2 hours earlier. Someone in the dark who cared less about the killing than about who would see it afterward. Except that this time it bought Nora and Kessler their lives, because whoever held those lights had turned the slope into a stage the 4 men refused to perform on, and the vehicle without plates switched off its beams, and Nora heard it reverse and turn and crawl away through the storm, and she stayed motionless in the snow with her heart pounding in her ears, and the question that had opened this whole night at 2:15 returned to find her, whole and sharper than before, who was filming, and this time it came with a companion she could not shake. That twice now, someone had recorded Roman Kessler at the worst moment of his life, and twice that someone had chosen not to finish him, as though his ruin were less the point than the record of it, and she had no time to follow the thought because Kessler was already climbing back up the slope, unhurried as ever, and he stopped near the fallen cedar, and Nora saw that one of the 4 had not withdrawn with the others, a dark shape half buried in the churned snow near the base of the slope, motionless, and she understood before Kessler said a word that his own people had left him behind, that the 2 pairs had retreated in perfect formation and simply not come back for the 4th, and she committed that detail to memory because it told her more about the people paying these men than anything else she had uncovered all night. That they were the kind who counted a man as finished the moment he stopped being useful, and Kessler crossed to the fallen figure, and there was a short sound in the dark, a single cry swallowed at once by the wind, and then silence. And when Nora reached them, the man was sitting upright against the trunk of the cedar, with his wrists bound in front of him with a zip tie taken from his own pack, his back to the wood, and Cassius lying a few feet away, neither growling nor moving, only breathing, and the man's whole body had gone rigid as a drawn wire, and Kessler crouched and pulled the pack toward himself, and did not open it yet. He only looked at the bound man for a long moment, and then looked back down the slope toward the place where the plateless vehicle had been. And Nora saw something on his face she had not seen there before, not anger, and not calculation, but the first thin edge of a question he could not answer, Because Roman Kessler had spent 10 years knowing everything that happened along this river after midnight, and twice tonight a camera had found him in the dark before he found it. And for the first time in longer than he could measure, there was something moving through his own town that he could not see, and he said nothing to Nora about it. He only reached for the pack and began to open it, and outside the ring of white, the storm went on breathing, and the question hung over both of them in the cold, patient and unanswered. Who were they filming it for? Kessler opened the pack, and there was not much inside. An external hard drive, black and unlabeled, sealed inside a zippered moisture-resistant pouch. A set of maps folded into quarters and printed on thick paper, the kind people used only when they did not want an electronic copy to exist anywhere, and a voice recorder. A cheap model with a gray plastic casing and a small red light blinking in the upper corner, and Nora stared at that light and felt her skin turn cold once again, because this was the third recording device she had crossed paths with tonight. And Kessler pressed rewind and waited 3 seconds and pressed play, and a voice filled the space between them, and it was warm. That was the first thing Nora thought, and it made her stomach turn. The voice of a man past 60 who had stood at podiums, delivering dedication speeches through 3 terms. The voice that had offered the final farewell at the memorial for the men this river had taken. The voice she had heard on the radio while washing dishes, and had been forced to switch off. And Gideon Ashcroft was not shouting, and he did not use a single ugly word. He was simply explaining with great patience what needed to be done to 1 man and 2 dogs, his tone as courteous as if he were instructing someone how to arrange chairs for a ceremony, and he used one word that Nora would never forget. He called it a performance. He said people needed to see it. He said that was the entire point, and Kessler switched off the recorder, and no one inside the small circle of white spoke for 4 seconds, because there it was, laid plain at last, the reason for the cable and the staging and the red light on the ice. The reason a killing had been dressed as a spectacle, and then Kessler reached over and pulled the hood back from the bound man's face. And he was young. That was what unsettled Nora most. Younger than she had expected, 23 or 24, his cheeks hollow from cold or hunger or both, the sparse ends of his beard frozen into tiny beads that caught the light, and he breathed through his mouth and he looked at Cassius, and then he looked at Kessler, and then he turned his head and looked at Nora. And before anyone had the chance to ask him a single question, he said, "I have a photograph of you in my pocket." And the whole slope seemed to fall silent. And Nora heard that silence the way a person hears a door closing behind them. And she said, "What?" her voice holding no breath. And the young man did not repeat himself. He only looked at her with an expression that was almost pity. The look of someone realizing that the person in front of him did not even know what game she had been playing, and he said from before, "I had a photograph of you from before I had one of him," and Nora felt the floor of the world drop out from under her, because she had believed she was here by chance, a poor reporter who had run out of gas, a statistical accident that had wandered into someone else's picture, and she was not. They had a photograph of her, and they had it before they had one of Roman Kessler, and slowly she turned her head to the left, and saw the thing she would remember longer than her father's voice on the recording. Kessler was looking at her, not at the young man, at her. And on that man's face for the first time in the whole of this night, there was something that had never been there before. He did not know. The man who had read her trade from her hands, and counted 4 guns from their echoes, and known for years everything that moved along this river after dark, was sitting in the snow, without understanding what had just happened. And for the first time Roman Kessler was not the person who knew the most in the room, and Nora looked at that unfamiliar expression on the most feared face in Corliss Landing, and felt her fear double, because whatever was moving through the dark tonight had planned around her before she had ever knelt on the ice, had placed her in this story on purpose. And neither she nor the man beside her had the first idea who had done it, and the young man watched them both understand this, and said nothing more. And the storm pressed in around the 3 of them, and the 2 dogs, and the question that had begun the night, bent quietly into a new and worse one. Not only who were they filming it for, But who had been arranging Nora Kostelic all along? There was a truck hidden behind the ice plant at the far end of the lock, a gray pickup left there since autumn, and Nora understood that it too belonged to the system of things Kessler had planted throughout the yard over the years, like the gun in the hollow wall, placed in advance exactly where it would be needed on the day everything came apart. And the cab was cramped, and the two dogs filled the space behind the seats, Cassius lying across half of Neva's body, and it smelled of wet fur and salt, and the storm, and Kessler did not start the engine, because starting it meant exhaust, and exhaust in a storm could be seen from 300 meters away. So they sat in the dark without heat, while the snow slowly covered the windshield layer by layer, until the whole world outside had become a white curtain half a meter from their faces, and Nora Kostelic, who had held everything down for the past 2 hours so she could stay alive, stopped holding it down, and she said, "You were there, 3 days before my father died. You spoke to him." And Kessler said yes, no hesitation, not even 1/100th of a second. And it was the speed of the answer that threw her off balance, because she had prepared herself for a denial. She had built 3 layers of questions, to break through 3 layers of defense, and he had swept them all away with a single word. And she said you could have helped him, and he said yes, and she waited for the rest. Waiting for the part every man she had ever interviewed always gave at exactly this moment. The part that began with, "but." The part about circumstances, about how it had been complicated then and she could not understand, about how he had done everything he could, and that part never came. He only said, "I did not." And he let the sentence lie there between them on the seat, naked and unbandaged. Exactly as it was, and Nora turned sharply toward him, waiting for him to defend himself, and he did not defend himself. He did not explain, and he did not ask her forgiveness, and he did not even behave as though he knew forgiveness was a thing a person might ask for. And Nora understood something that made her want to scream, that she could not hate him properly, because hatred needed an excuse. It needed a lie to point at, and a cowardice to despise, and this man gave her none of those things. He laid his guilt on the table whole, and told her to do with it whatever she wished, and for 7 years she had built a monster in her mind, so she would have something to hate, and now the monster sat half a meter away, admitting everything, and giving her nothing she could use. And she wanted to hit him, and she saw it clearly in her mind, the swing, the way his head would turn, and she also saw what would happen after, that he would do nothing, that he would simply turn back and look at her, and she would have to live with that look, and she did both things in her mind, and neither in the world. She only sat with her cracked hands clenched in her lap. And outside the wind shifted, and Kessler moved. He slipped one hand into his coat pocket and drew something out, and Nora recognized it at once, because she had held it 4 hours earlier on the ice. The pocket watch. Its steel casing scratched until nearly all the plating was gone, a diagonal crack running across its glass face, and he did not open it. He only held it in his palm with his thumb resting on the lid and stared at it for 4 seconds, with an expression Nora had never seen on him and would not see again until the last night, and then he put it away, and she said it stopped at 3:47. I saw it, what happened at 3:47, and Kessler did not answer. He reached for the key and turned it, and the engine came to life, and the snow began sliding off the windshield in heavy sheets. And Nora sat with the question unanswered beside all the others, and understood that this man kept his wounds the way he kept his guns, hidden in the walls, placed where no one would find them, and that the broken watch in his pocket was a debt he had been carrying far longer than the one he owed her father, and that he would pay neither of them tonight in words. They came into town from the west near 4:45, and Corliss Landing appeared through the storm in scattered fragments. A rooftop, a utility pole, the blinking yellow light at the yard road crossing that no one had ever repaired, and Kessler meant to circle behind the row of warehouses, but he could not, because someone was standing at the end of the street, a woman, alone beneath the one streetlight still burning, without a vehicle and without anyone beside her, both hands tucked into the pockets of a long charcoal coat, and she did not move when the headlights swept across her face. She simply stood there and waited with the posture of a person who had calculated precisely where they would have to pass, and had been standing in that place for a very long time. And Kessler stopped the truck, and Nora looked through the windshield and recognized her. And she did not recognize her from a file or a photograph or a name. She recognized her from table number 9, the corner table by the window with a view of both doors. The woman who came every Tuesday evening and ordered the same plain meal and 1 glass of water without ice. Who read a paperback without ever turning more than a few pages. Who sat for exactly an hour and 40 minutes, and paid in cash, and left a tip of exactly 20%, not 1 cent more, and not 1 cent less, and Nora had stood beside that table and asked whether she needed anything else 47 times, and she counted the number in 3 seconds, because 47 weeks was exactly the span from last autumn until now, and the woman had not missed a single Tuesday. And Nora opened the truck door and stepped out into the snow, and the woman said, "Miss Kostelik," and Nora asked, "Who are you?" though she already knew this was no ordinary customer, and the woman said, "Lena Frost," and she did not take out any identification. She did not need to. And Nora asked, "How long have you been here?" And Frost said, 11 months. And Nora stood motionless. 11 months. 47 Tuesday nights. 47 times she had poured this woman water and asked how the food was. And once in November, when Nora had dropped an entire tray because her hands were numb with cold, this very woman had crouched down to help her gather the broken pieces, and told her it was all right, in the voice of a kind stranger. And Nora said, "You sat in my restaurant for 11 months. You heard everything people said inside that room. You are investigating Ashcroft." And Frost did the thing Nora would remember for the rest of her life. She stayed silent for exactly 1 beat. The same beat Nora herself had caught in Kessler hours earlier, when she had spoken her own last name. And then Frost said no, and she looked past Nora's shoulder into the truck at the man sitting silently behind the wheel, and she said, "I am investigating him." And the world tilted slightly beneath Nora's feet, because inside her coat at that moment were a hard drive and a set of maps, and a cheap recorder holding the voice of Gideon Ashcroft, and a phone that had recorded 20 minutes on the slope, including footage of Roman Kessler firing a gun in the dark, and she was carrying the exact weapon that could destroy the man who had just kept her alive, and she understood at once why this woman was standing alone beneath a streetlight in a storm with no vehicle and no team. She had not come to arrest anyone. She had come to receive a delivery, and Frost took one hand from her pocket and held it out palm upward, catching the snow, and she said, "Give me the hard drive." And she said it without urgency. The way a person asks for a thing they are certain they will get one way or another, because Frost had already made her calculation, that whatever was on that drive would surface no matter who held it now, that a man like Kessler wrapped in a scandal this size would come apart in the papers within the week, and lay everything she needed at her feet, without her ever having to force a single door. And so she did not need to take it tonight. She only had to ask. And Nora looked at that open hand for a long time, longer than the 40 seconds she had spent on the ice, and then she closed her own hand around the drive inside her pocket, and said no. And she stepped back into the truck and pulled the door shut. And the federal door that might have caught her father's killers swung quietly closed with her on the outside of it, and Lena Frost did not move to stop her. She only watched the truck begin to pull away, and the fact that she did not follow was more frightening than if she had, because it meant she did not need to. Kessler drove into the alley behind the abandoned cannery and shut off the engine and said nothing for a while, and then he said, "Give me the hard drive," and Nora laughed, the sound escaping before she could stop it, short and dry, and without the least trace of amusement, and she said, "You too," and she said, "Not like her," and he said then, "How is it different?" And he told her his way in that same steady voice, while Nora listened with a chill running down her spine, because it was not a threat, it was a plan. He had the names of the 3 people who had touched the food, and within 6 hours he would know which one had done it, and within 12 hours he would know which account had paid that person. And that account would lead to a name, and that name would lead to Gideon Ashcroft. And by tomorrow night, he said, tomorrow night alone, there would be no Gideon Ashcroft left, no court, and no paperwork, and no newspaper article. Only a man past 60 who failed to appear at Monday morning's commission meeting, and a town that would talk about it for 3 weeks before moving on. Certain victory. One night, no one would ever know, and Nora said no, and he turned to look at her, and he said, Miss Kostelic, your way takes 6 months if it works, and it may fail. And she said yes. And he said, do you understand how much money he has? And she said, I understand. And he said, do you understand that in 6 months he can buy anyone standing between him and you? And she said, I understand. And he said, then why? And Nora Kostelic sat in that freezing cab with her cracked hands resting on her thighs, and told him the thing she had not told anyone in 7 years. She said, your way takes 1 night, you win, Ashcroft disappears, and the next morning my father is still a fisherman who drowned through his own carelessness in the official record. 2 words in the corner of a file. Accidental death, forever. And she turned to look at him, and she said, my mother is at Bayside. She does not remember me. Some days she remembers my father, and on those days she asks me why he was so careless. She asks me why he went out when the water was rough. She has asked me that 4 times this year, and all 4 times I had to sit there and look at her, and I had nothing to say, because the only thing in this world that told her who my father truly was had been flipped open with 1 finger by a man and pushed back across a desk toward me, and outside the wind had begun to die. It had howled all night, and now it only breathed. And she said, if you kill Ashcroft, that file will never be reopened. No one reopens a case that belongs to a dead man. You cannot erase what was written on paper by erasing the person who wrote it. You only nail it shut. And she drew a breath and said, I do not want Ashcroft dead. I want him recorded. And Kessler was silent, and he stayed silent a long time. Long enough for Nora to hear snow sliding off the cannery roof, and she had begun to understand that this man was not silent because he did not know what to say. He was silent because he was calculating. And during those 2 minutes he calculated. He calculated that if he followed her way, the hard drive would come into the light, and everything on that drive would lead not only to Ashcroft. He calculated that the woman in the charcoal coat had spent 11 months at table number 9, waiting for exactly this day, and that a newspaper story would hand her everything she had not managed to obtain in those months. Neatly packaged and time-stamped and supported by physical evidence, he calculated that Nora Kostelic's way would bring down Gideon Ashcroft, and it would bring him down as well, and he did not flinch from that arithmetic. He looked straight at the price of his own ruin, and set it against the 2 words on a dead fisherman's file, and the face of a woman who could not answer her own mother, and he chose, and he nodded, and he said, all right, nothing more, 1 word. And in 34 years Roman Kessler had never once yielded to anyone about anything, and that was precisely how he had survived until this night. And he had just thrown it away inside a dark truck behind an abandoned cannery because a woman who weighed 115 pounds had told him she wanted the truth about her father written down correctly. And Nora looked at him, and did not understand all of it, and she would not understand all of it, until 4 days later, on a hill, when it was already too late to say anything about it, and neither of them spoke of it, and Kessler turned the key, and asked, where is your newsroom? The offices of the Corliss Ledger sat on the 2nd floor of a red brick building on Main Street above a pharmacy that had closed the year before, and Essie Ward opened the door for Nora at 5:15 in the morning, wearing pajamas beneath a wool coat, her hair tied back in haste, without the least trace of surprise on her face, because she was 44 years old and had spent 22 years in journalism. And one of the things those years had taught her was that when someone knocks on your door before dawn, what they carry with them is always the same thing, and she did not ask why Nora was soaked through, and she did not ask why a gray pickup was parked on the street below, with 2 enormous dogs in the cab, and a man sitting behind the wheel without getting out. She simply switched on the desk lamp, and sat down and said, show me. And Nora placed everything on the desk, And Essie read. She read the maps one sheet at a time, slowly tracing the red lines. She examined the 4 photographs on the phone with 8% of its battery left. The blue drums arranged in their rows, the labels bearing the coordinates of the discharge point. She watched the video recorded on the slope, and she watched it twice. And then she listened to the recording on the gray plastic recorder, the warm, courteous voice explaining with such patience that people needed to see it, and Nora watched Essie's face as she listened, and Essie did not take notes, and that was the first detail that felt wrong, because in 2 years Nora had never once seen Essie Ward listen to anything without a pen in her hand. And the recording ended, and Essie switched off the device and sat motionless for 6 seconds, and then she pushed the entire file back across the desk toward Nora with both hands, and said, "I am not publishing this." And Nora did not understand. She truly did not understand. And for 3 full seconds she sat waiting for the rest of the sentence, waiting for the word but, waiting for a condition, waiting for Essie to say they needed another source, or that a lawyer had to review it first, or that they should wait until Monday, and Essie said Nora, and she lowered herself into her chair, and in the lamplight, Nora saw that she looked more exhausted than the storm that had just passed through the town, and she said, "In the past 2 years, have you ever once asked who pays my salary?" And Nora opened her mouth and nothing came out, and Essie said, "No, you never asked, because you are young, and you believe a newspaper is simply a newspaper." And she opened the bottom drawer and took out a stack of yellowed papers, and set them on the desk without opening them, and said the Harbor Commission owns 40% of this paper, and has for 11 years. They bought in during the season we nearly closed, and they called it a community investment, and an editorial thanking them ran on page 3, and I was the one who wrote it, and Nora sat there and heard Kessler's question from hours earlier, returned to her whole and unchanged. "Do you know who owns your newspaper?" And this time it came with its answer, and Essie said, "I am not afraid of him." And her voice was not defensive, and that was the worst part. She said, "I am fairly certain he cannot do much to me, but I have 19 employees, and for 7 of them this job is the only thing they have left. You know Denise in advertising, you know young Foley. If I publish this at 6 in the morning, then by noon I will have unemployed people in a town that has not had a real job to offer in 7 years. And he will still be sitting somewhere eating his breakfast." And Nora was quiet, because there was no argument to make against 19 names, and then she did not argue. She pulled her laptop from her backpack, a machine 7 years old that would run only while plugged into the wall, and she connected it beneath Essie's desk, and she did not ask permission. She connected the hard drive and opened her email. And she did not send it to one newspaper, she sent it to 9 newspapers, in 9 different states. Newsrooms where she had submitted freelance work for 4 years and been turned away. Editors whose names she had kept in a text file from the days when she still believed someone might answer her one day, and she attached everything, no summary and no plea, every original file intact and time-stamped. 9 identical copies, leaving that town at the same moment, at 5:42 in the morning, and Essie Ward watched her do it, and did not try to stop her. Because what no one could own, no one could bury, and the 2 of them sat in the dark newsroom and watched the little progress bar cross the screen 9 times, and neither of them said a word until it was done. The first newspaper ran the story at 11 minutes past 6 in the morning, a newsroom in a city 3 states away, where a night editor listened to the first 30 seconds of the recording and immediately called the editor-in-chief at home, and the second published at 20 past 6. And by 7 all 9 had run it, and by 8 it was no longer 9 newspapers. It had become something else, something that had escaped everyone's control, copied and quoted and cut into short clips and played again and again on screens across the country, that warm, courteous voice explaining with such patience that people needed to see it, and now people truly had, and Gideon Ashcroft was arrested before noon, and Nora would hear the details later and turn them over for a long time. That he had been sitting at the head of the table in the Harbor Commission conference room, serving his 3rd term, presiding over an item on the agenda concerning the renewal of a dredging permit, wearing a pale gray sweater, and that when they came in through the main door without knocking, there were already 3 cameras waiting in the hallway, and that the old man had raised his head and looked directly into the lenses with the expression of someone certain this was a misunderstanding that would be settled before dinner, and he did not cover his face. And Nora would remember that detail longer than almost any other, and the search warrants spread like water breaking through a levee, and by that afternoon 14 shell companies had been uncovered. Harmless names registered in faraway states, signatures placed after midnight, and every dredging permit in 3 river towns was frozen within the day, and 2 members of the commission resigned before the week was out, and a 3rd was stopped at an airport, and the town that had lowered its voice for 7 years began, slowly, to speak, and in the middle of all of it, quietly, on the same day, without cameras and without handcuffs, the other thing began. 2 vehicles parked outside the yard office and cardboard boxes carried out for 4 straight hours, because Roman Kessler had come under investigation as well. And Lena Frost had everything now. She had the hard drive and the video from the slope, and 11 months at table number 9, and everything else a federal file could uncover, once it had been handed a reason to start digging. And none of this surprised him, because he had known it from the moment he nodded inside the dark truck behind the cannery. He had seen it in the arithmetic before he ever spoke the word all right, that the same light which would fall on Ashcroft would fall on him, that Nora's way did not spare him, and was never going to, and he had chosen it anyway with his eyes open. And the thing that told the whole story of the man was that he never once mentioned it to her. He did not call to remind her what her 9 emails had cost him. He did not lay the price at her feet, or ask her to weigh it against her father. He simply let the boxes be carried out of his office into the gray afternoon and said nothing, because he had entered the cost in a ledger only he could see on the night he agreed to pay it. And a debt a man takes on with open eyes is not one he complains about when it comes due, and Nora, watching from a distance as the federal agents worked, understood for the first time the full shape of what he had done in that truck. That he had not merely allowed her to win, he had chosen his own ruin as the price of letting her father's name be written down correctly. And she stood in the cold street, and did not know yet how to carry that. And above the town the sky had finally cleared, and the story she had sent out for free at 5:42 in the morning went on spreading across the country without her, belonging now to no one, and therefore to everyone, impossible to own and impossible to bury, exactly as she had needed it to be. The river reopened on a Thursday. The fishing ban lifted late in the afternoon, after the state collected real samples for the first time in 7 years. Genuine mud that smelled of metal. And on Friday morning 9 boats went out beneath the gray-silver light of a thawing January, and they came back close to noon. And Nora stood at the end of the pier, and heard it before she saw it, a sound the town had forgotten. Cheering, children running along the pier, a whole crowd of them, wool hats slipping toward the backs of their necks, pointing out toward the water and shouting when the first boat rounded the headland, riding low, low, because it was heavy, low because its hold was full. And a boat horn sounded across the ice, and somewhere behind her, the adults began to applaud, and a little girl with her hair braided on both sides turned and saw Nora standing there, and waved to her, for no reason at all except that this was the kind of day when people waved. And Nora waved back, long after all the children had run away, and that evening, she still reported for her 6 o'clock shift at the diner, because the next payment to the nursing home was still due, and a story that had run across 9 states had not paid her a single cent, and the place was more crowded than she had seen it in 3 years, and she was wiping down a table near the window when an old man came toward her, in his 70s, wearing a faded life vest, his hands still wet, and Nora knew his face without knowing his name. One of the men who nursed a single drink at the counter through the evening, and he said nothing. He only placed a fish on the table in front of her. No wrapping and no newspaper. Just a single cod laid directly on the wood she had just cleaned, river water still shining on its scales, and then he gave her one nod, and turned and walked out the door. and Nora stood there with the cleaning cloth in her hand. Because it was the first fish caught in this river in 7 years, and she sat down slowly in the chair across from it and stared at it for a very long time, and she had not cried on the ice at 2 in the morning, and she had not cried in the shed, and she had not cried when she heard her father's voice inside a freezing cold storage building 10 degrees below zero, but she cried there, in a noisy restaurant, in front of a fish, because grief that could not be moved by any large thing came loose at last, in front of a small one, a single cod on a wooden table, the plainest proof in the world that the river was alive again, and that her father had not been careless, and had not been wrong, that the water he had died trying to protect was clean enough now to give up a fish to an old man's net. And no one in the restaurant understood why the waitress was crying, and Nora did not try to explain, she only sat with it, and later, she wrapped the fish and took it home, and there was no reward waiting for her there. That was the truest thing she came to understand. No envelope and no offer from a newsroom in a bigger city. No one knocking on her door to hand her anything. The story had run across 9 states, and paid her exactly nothing, because she had sent it out for free at dawn, and she would do exactly the same thing again, if she had to. And she was still poor, and still wore the same apron, and still carried the same paring knife in her pocket, and her car still sat dead outside the laundromat, needing a part she could not afford. But that night, for the first time in 7 years, Nora Kostelic slept 6 hours instead of 4, and that was the whole of the reward, and it was enough, because for 7 years she had not slept more than 4, and now she did, and she woke without the weight she had carried into every morning since her father went out on the water and did not come back. The call came the next morning from Denise at the billing office of the Bayside nursing home, a woman Nora had spoken to once a month for 7 years, always about the same thing, about how she needed a few more days, and this time Denise did not say anything about a few more days. She said that her mother's account had been paid, and Nora asked how much. And Denise said 18 months, and Nora stood in the hallway of the laundromat beneath her rented room, still holding her laundry basket, and made her repeat the number 3 times, $55,200, paid in full, a bank transfer with no sender's name, only a transaction code, and a blank memo line, and she reached Bayside within 40 minutes, and they printed the receipt for her, and she sat in the plastic chair outside the hallway for 20 minutes, unable to read a single word on it, because that number was 3.5 years of night shifts, everything she had gone without sleep for over 7 years, erased with the click of a mouse. And then the anger came, and she took the receipt to the yard office where the federal seals still marked the front doors, and Kessler was working in the back room. And she walked past the man who stood and then sat back down when he saw her face, and she threw the receipt onto the desk in front of him and said, "I will not accept it." And he looked at the paper and did not touch it, and said it was not me. And she said, "Do not lie to me." And he looked up, and Nora had learned to read the emptiness on that face, and this time there was something on it. Not anger, something thinner and sharper. And he said, "Nora, I do not lie." And he placed the hand missing one joint of the smallest finger lightly on the desk. "I do many things. You have read 9 newspaper stories about the things I do, and I will not argue a single word in any of them. But I do not lie. That is all I have." And she stood there and understood it was true. Because this man had been given a dozen chances in the past days to lie to her about things far larger than this, and had not taken one, and she lowered her hand and said, "Then who?" And Kessler picked up the receipt and angled it toward the light from the window and read the transaction code, and Nora watched the change happen piece by piece, his eyes stopping somewhere in the middle of the string of characters, returning to the beginning, reading it a second time and then a third, and his face emptied for 2 full seconds, the way a building empties when its power is cut. And during those 2 seconds, Nora saw the man beneath the man, and he looked far younger than she had imagined, and he set the receipt down and said, "This is not a bank code. It is an internal code. The first letters name the account, and the last numbers name the person who authorized the payment. and he looked up and asked her the question she would hear inside her mind every night for the rest of her life. Do you have a sister? And Nora felt the floor tilt. Because Vera Kostelic, 31 years old, had walked out of Corliss Landing 3 weeks after their father's funeral, leaving no letter and answering no calls. And for 7 years Nora had carried 2 wounds instead of 1, her father at the bottom of the lock, and the sister who had abandoned her in the worst week of her life, and she had built a selfish Vera in her mind, because she needed someone to be angry at. And Kessler turned the screen of the office computer toward her, and Nora looked at an employee badge photograph taken years earlier. Dark hair, heavy glasses, a name that was not her sister's, chief accountant of Kessler's operation, and he said she worked for me for 7 years. I sat in the same room with her 1,000 times. She made my coffee, and the truth came apart slowly, and it was the cruelest thing in the whole of it. Because Vera had not been trapped, she had walked into that place on purpose. A young woman who had just finished studying accounting and had sat down and calculated that the only way to learn who had killed her father was not to knock on a police station door, but to enter the thing that had killed him and stay until it trusted her, and she had needed 7 years because the records of such a place existed nowhere in one piece, and she had become one of the 3 people who mixed the dog's food, and she had staged the night on the ice herself, because she had known her sister's schedule for 7 years, known that Nora finished at 2, and that her car had run dry 3 days earlier, and that she would walk home along the yard, and she had placed Roman Kessler exactly where Nora would be forced to pass, and the red light in the dark had been hers, filming it not as a threat but for Nora. And on the night everything collapsed, she had drawn the last money from a burning account, and cleared her mother's debt, and disappeared a second time, and Nora stood in that kitchen and understood that her sister had not abandoned her, and had used her, and that both things were true at once, and did not cancel each other. They only lay side by side, and she would have to live with both. 4 days after the storm, they climbed Marrow Point Hill before the sun had risen, and the snow had thinned there, revealing patches of dark earth and stubborn clumps of grass that had survived 7 winters worse than this one. And when the light finally came, it came slowly, a pale gold spreading across the surface of the river before crawling back up through the branches. And for one perfect moment, everything frozen on that hill turned to glass, and the 2 of them stood beside each other without touching, close enough to feel each other's warmth in the air below freezing. And Nora said, "People say you are going to prison," and Kessler said 18 months, maybe longer, and she said, "Are you afraid?" And he stared out across the water for a long time, long enough that she thought he would not answer. And below them, 3 boats were passing through the mouth of the river, riding high, because their holds were still empty, and they would return at noon riding low. And he said, "I spent 34 years holding on to things no one could take from me, and it turns out, the only thing I wanted to keep was the one thing I had no right to keep." And she did not ask what he meant, because she already knew. And the wind shifted, and he slipped one hand into his coat pocket, and she heard it touch that hard round object, and he said 3:47 without turning to look at her. "That was the time my mother died. I was 11, and Nora stood very still, and he said I stopped the watch because I thought that if I stopped it, then it had not happened yet, and he withdrew his hand from his pocket empty, and he said it still happened. And Nora understood at last that the broken watch he had carried through every year and every deal signed after midnight was not a thing that told time. It was a boy of 11 trying to hold a single morning still, and that the man who could read a stranger's whole life from her hands had spent his own life unable to read his way past one stopped hour. And behind them Cassius and Neva sat together on the slope, alert but relaxed, their 2 tails sweeping slow arcs across the thin snow, and they wore new collars, thick leather made by hand, still carrying their fresh scent, and Nora bent down and saw a small steel tag on each one, and each tag bore a single engraved word, Wren, her father's boat. And she stared at it for a very long time, and did not ask why, because she had begun to understand that some debts are never spoken aloud, that this man would never tell her he was sorry for being right, and would never explain why he had not helped, and would never offer words capable of undoing anything. He only kept accounts. He recorded everything precisely, without overlooking a single debt. And he repaid them in the only way he knew, with things that needed no words. And the sun climbed higher, and the golden light slipped off the surface of the river, and crept up to where they stood, and the glass branches began to drip. And winter loosened its grip. And Kessler asked, "What will you do?" And Nora considered the question longer than it deserved, thinking of 9 newsrooms in 9 states, and of places where a person could begin again, where no one knew her father's name. And then she thought of her mother at Bayside, and of a sister, somewhere out there, with 2 sides hunting her, and of a little girl with her hair braided on both sides, who had waved from the pier, because it was a day when people waved. And she said, "Stay. Write about what happens after the headlines disappear, and some of the hardest battles do not arrive with sirens or uniforms. They come quietly, through pressure, and through fear, and through the slow erosion of the things we love, until one morning we wake, and find that the town that raised us has died without anyone hearing the sound of it." And this story reminds us that courage does not always mean rushing forward. Sometimes it means kneeling beside someone the whole town wants to see brought down. Sometimes it means choosing the truth when silence would be so much easier, and when that truth will not pay a single dollar. And sometimes it simply means refusing to take one more step. And if this story moved you in any way, we would love for you to subscribe to our channel, and to like and share this video, so you will not miss the new stories we bring you every day. And we would truly love to know how this story made you feel. So please leave a comment, and share with us what stirred in your heart as you listened. Because the thing we treasure most is hearing honestly from you. And to everyone watching this video right now, we wish you good health and a life that is joyful and peaceful with each passing day. Thank you for staying to the very last line. Goodbye, and we will see you again in the next video. Because the snow in Corliss Landing forgets quickly, but some people never do.